Hello, welcome to the Jigsaw Research Social Media webinar. It's amazing to think that it's only 10 years or so since Facebook and all the rest entered our lives, pretty much changing them forever. And there's been a lot of discussion about how it has and how it will change us as people. To what extent are people adopting different personas online versus revealing their actual real selves? And at a research industry level, there's been discussion about what the implications are on methodology. Of course, we want authentic conversations with the real person, whatever that means. But how can we best achieve those conversations? And today we're going to share two presentations with you. The first one, which I'm going to talk through, is called Freedom to Reveal or Freedom to Project, an exploration into the impact social media has on personal identity. A bit grandiose, but hopefully it will be an interesting paper. After that, I'm going to hand over to my colleague Julie, who's going to talk to the subject of navigating a virtual world, mapping social media engagement. So let's start then by talking about identity and what it means in an online world. The subject of identity and what it means has been something that philosophers certainly have been debating for many, many centuries. And more recently, social psychologists have taken up the cudgels. And there's been a lot of questions around identity, but perhaps the central question has been over that time, is it a fixed thing that's in us and permanent and unchanging? Or is it some dynamic that changes according to context or even according to mood? Social media has added another layer to this debate because now there is a permanent 24/7 avenue for self-expression. What impact has that had on our sense of identity? These are the questions we'll be discussing in a moment. We'll also be drilling down into the research implications. How can we access authentic self as researchers? And indeed, what is the relationship between us, between our different personas, our online ones and our kind of real personas, if you like? How do those two things relate to each other? So being researchers, of course, we decided to do a research project to find out. And it's pretty clear right from the beginning for us, this demanded a little bit of a different approach from the normal research and design. If we're going to talk to people about identity, if we're going to follow them and their self-expression across the real world, but also into the world of the virtual, then we need to see them and build relationships with them, not just interview them for the hour or so, but actually commit more to investing in a relationship with them. So we kept it small but deep. We actually recruited 10 heavy users of social media, and we designed quite a creative methodology to really track the differences and the kind of the faces they show the world in real life versus in social media sites like Twitter and Facebook. So there are two phases to the research. The first phase then, phase one, we created these 10 relationships, if you like. And for 5 of them, we started the relationship with a traditional kind of face-to-face step interview in their home. We then asked permission to follow them on social media, and we did that for about 2 or 3 weeks. The other half of the sample, the other 5 heavy users, we did exactly the opposite way around. So we followed them on social media first, created an impression of them in our minds, and then actually went to meet them in their homes to see what they're actually really like. That was phase one. Phase two, we invited those same 10 people to take part on a bulletin board debate on 2 very controversial areas, immigration and sexism. And these are subjects we also have briefly talked about in the face-to-face interviews as well. And hopefully the reason behind the methodology here, we want to see whether they reveal different things in the bulletin board debate than they did actually in the face-to-face sessions we had with them. So What we want to do first is talk about the bigger stuff. What impact is social media having on our lives and our sense of ourselves as having identities and being certain types of individuals? And what we'll do first of all is nail a few myths. It's always fun to do that. And there are 3 myths that we want to bust, if you like. The first one is a myth that you hear a lot, and that is that social media output is actually spontaneous, unfiltered expression. Absolutely not. If anything, we actually found that there's greater control exercise, greater editing, if you like, of self online than there was in the real world. So you can go down the pub with someone, you might make an inappropriate comment or whatever. It's no big deal. People forget. But if you actually said something inappropriate online, or something a bit grandiose or a bit kind of big-headed, then it would be there forever. Therefore, there are greater consequences to what you reveal online than there are to what you reveal offline. There's also a sense that people scrutinize what people say online in a much harsher way. It's a much more judgmental environment. The other thing we found was that far from it being spontaneous and unfiltered, people were actually using social media to shape and revise their own identities. And this could happen in a big way. There's one particular guy that springs to mind who we'll talk a little bit more about later, who actually saw social media, and Facebook in particular, as a way of almost creating a new version of himself. On the other end of the spectrum, there was a girl we spoke to who just wanted to be a little bit more upbeat. And she decided, her mother had said she's quite a negative person, so she decided to really try and be a little bit more positive online than perhaps she was in real life. Interestingly, though, that kind of freedom to shape and revise your identity very quickly seems to become a pressure to do so, and with a kind of anxiety attached to it. So people were using the freedom to recreate themselves a little or revise the sense of self, but they felt very quickly they had to be loyal to that new image, and it became quite an anxious process, which is quite a worrying thing to observe. So that's the first myth. Social media is not spontaneous, unfiltered expression. The second myth is a related one, and that is you can be who you really are on social media. Again, quite the reverse. The people we spoke to were very careful about the image they projected, and they wanted to project a certain positive ideal self, and they also wanted to avoid, equally passionately, being mistaken for a negative internet persona, and we'll talk about that in a second. But first of all, there's a consensual perspective that people wanted to come across as witty, as social, busy people, i.e. important, I guess, popular, but also a little bit intellectual and bohemian. And they could be quite creative how they did this stuff. They didn't necessarily do it in an obvious way. For example, one person wanted to kind of, really demonstrate how sophisticated they were because they were going to the opera. But rather than just saying, tonight I'm going to the opera, which is a bit crude really and a bit transparent, they actually said instead, the traffic's awful, I think I'm going to be late to the opera. Same impression, but hopefully the same message, but hopefully not just boasting. That's how they intended it to come across. There's one guy actually said that, online he's definitely funnier than he was in real life, and I can actually testify that was the case. So there's also a negative type of person or persona that people are trying to avoid. There are certain types of people on the internet and on the web that we all know and we all don't want to be mistaken for. There's the troll, of course, and when I say troll, that doesn't mean necessarily that people are abusing other people. It is those sort of people who are more assertive and more argumentative online than you are in real life. No one wants to be seen as one of those people. There's also this other type of person called what people call the oversharer. And these are people who seem to live their life through social media. No one wants to be seen as living their life secondhand. And then there was the attention seeker. And the attention seeker was someone who would often really put out a kind of a status update, which is really kind of deliberately ambivalent and deliberately kind of encouraging people to kind of follow up with "Are you okay, darling?" There's a quote there at the bottom. The ambiguous update, worst day ever, without any more detail, but really is saying, "Oh, ask me more." Another myth busted. Let's now in the mood. Let's do one more. And the third myth is that social media is for extroverts. Well, what we found was that it is important for extroverts, but they have a much more functional relationship with the medium than introverts tend to. So they tend to use it as an extension of their social lives. So it's great that they can actually talk to friends more in different places. They can even use it to arrange more face-to-face meetings. But introverts have a much deeper relationship. They're not necessarily using it more, but they're using it differently and it's playing a different role. A couple of them talked about being comfortable in social interaction for the first time, which is quite a thing to admit. And those introverts are much more likely to talk about the revolutionary impact that social media had on their lives, and we'll introduce you to a character who felt that in a little while. So for extroverts, it's an extension of themselves, but for introverts, social media actually offered the opportunity to be themselves for the first time. Now we'll talk a little bit about self-esteem in social media, because there's been a lot in the paper about that. And there is evidence to suggest that as a society, we have become more narcissistic. And there's quantitative evidence to suggest that we are more navel-gazing and more concerned with ourselves than we used to be. And it's quite interesting to debate whether or not social media has played a role in that. It could be argued two ways. It could be the case that social media was actually created to cater for that new need. But we did discover that even people who seemed quite robust emotionally do get dragged in to a kind of a more kind of introspective way of being through social media. And there's a really important quote here in the middle of this page, and it says, "I thought the like thing was stupid, but then you do it once and you realise people need you to like their stuff. They like you back, and you're pulled into the whole thing." So there does seem, it's a very small sample, suggests that it does seem to be a kind of element to social media that does drag you in to this much more kind of introspective way of being. There's also been things in the paper about the addictive nature of social media. And again, we found some signs to back that up. There did seem to be a real regular need for fixes of self-esteem that social media made very accessible. What social media can do, it can actually quantify your self-esteem in a sense, because you can see how many likes you've had, how many likes your witty comic has earned, how many retweets your controversial tweet has actually earned. And it can give you a kind of a real instant high if what you've said has gone down well, you've been favorited, for example. And on the other hand, it can also give you a low. So if people ignore that wonderfully witty remark, like it's never been made, there's no likes on it or no retweeting or anything like that, you can feel very low. And it is a bit of a roller coaster ride. And therefore, and there's an addictive nature to it. It feels like gambling. You turn on your mobile phone, you go to your Facebook page, and you either get a thumbs up or you get a thumbs down. And we did find people who couldn't even walk 100 yards without checking to see how their latest comment had gone down. So it's a bit worrying, but there does seem to be a kind of, not only a kind of an encouragement to be more introspective through social media, but it does seem to be something that people can get addicted to. Okay, so we've talked about the bigger stuff. Let's talk from a research perspective here. And if you remember what in that methodology we talked about earlier, what we did is we actually followed some people first on social media, then met them in real life, and the other half of the sample we did the other way round. And what is, I think, worth doing here is introducing 3 of those participants and sharing with you the impressions they gave face to face versus on social media, or the other way round. So 3 profiles for you here. Obviously, we've obscured the names and given them kind of little monikers. So the first one is someone we call the cool music producer. And, you know, he was someone we followed online first. And he was incredibly cool and incredibly trendy and used all sorts of kind of slang and things and words we didn't understand. You know, he was in the music business and kind of seemed very attendant on his kind of image. So we went off, after following online for a couple of weeks, we went off to meet him, a little bit nervous, not quite sure who we'd actually find. Interestingly, the person we actually met was very different from our perceptions, a very different impression given on the social media. He was a very well-spoken businessman and couldn't be less like the kind of trendy, cool guy we were expecting. And we challenged him on that. We said, look, you come across in a particular way, you're kind of much more respectful and kind of more likable, frankly, than you are online. We're quite honest with him. And he said, well, look, you know what, I'm building a brand here, and it's a music business, and you just have to kind of come across a certain way. That's why I dial up the coolness when I'm online. And we felt there was some truth in that, but we felt it went a little bit deeper. We had the hunch that he'd always wanted to be that cool character, and social media has actually given him the tools to do that. Okay, let's look at someone else. This is someone called the Introvert Unleashed, and this is a person we referred to a little bit earlier on. And essentially, this is someone we followed first on social media, and then we met in real life. And in social media, they're a bit of a kind of a shock jock, let's put it that way. Kind of quite provocative, kind of right-wing libertarian, always getting into kind of arguments with other people online. You know the sort of person I mean. But when we actually met the person, what we actually found was a timid people pleaser who actually really was an IT guy. I'm not kidding, he really was. But a really nice guy. And he was a guy that felt that social media had allowed him the freedom to be who he really is for the first time. He is that inside himself, he is the Rush Limbaugh, he is that shock jock. And social media has given him an avenue to show that side of his personality. Well, it also happens the other way around, because sometimes people's impression, the impression we got when we met someone, is actually challenged by the things they said or did online. So this guy, we're calling the modern man unmasked. And when my colleague Sue met him, he was very respectful, very right on, said all the right things about women, and kind of he had daughters, he wanted to go to university, and he's a very right on guy. However, when we followed him online, it turned out that he revealed another side to himself, whether it's a real self or not, who knows. But a bit of a sexist side, and he made some rather inappropriate jokes, which I can't repeat here, which kind of filled my colleague Sue with absolute horror. So clearly, then, people are using social media to show different sides of themselves, and they would in the normal run of things. So, and this study was really great way of exploring the impressions people gave in real life and the impressions they gave in social media. The last question, though, is a very direct one. Do people reveal more online than they do in face-to-face? Because this is something that some online researchers have actually claimed. Is it true, or is it another myth that we need to nail? Well, we could actually make that comparison to some degree, because if you remember from the methodology, we talked about certain sensitive issues in the face-to-face step interview, and we then talked about those things on the bulletin board online. And what we found was interesting, not clear-cut as you might expect, but interesting. And I think what online researchers tend to do when they make these claims that people reveal their true selves only online is the ability that a trained quantitative researcher has to create a relationship of trust. And that it's a relationship where they can actually explore deeply and in a safe environment what the respondent really thinks. And you can coax out all sorts of truth in that situation. All sorts of opinions can be revealed in the right circumstances with the right researcher. To give an example of that, we talked about immigration. On the left-hand side of that page is what one of our interviewers said on the bulletin board. They were very kind of cautious. They said, well, there were pros and cons about immigration, quite guarded. In the interview we did, the same person, right from the beginning, was much more opinionated because they felt confident and unjudged. And they actually said something quite controversial, which was, God, I'm beginning to hate this country. There's an Iranian guy in the post office who's so rude. Why does he stay here? So that really does challenge this sense that people are always more honest online in anonymity of an online world. It doesn't necessarily free you up to be more honest. And a relationship with a skilled quantitative researcher can create that non-judgmental environment. However, it's a grey area because the other thing we did notice was that though people are quite cautious online, if they were challenged by someone else online, they tend to overcompensate and spiral a little bit out of control, but they're very passionate very quickly, perhaps more so than they would in a face-to-face environment. So they kind of had a measured tone at first, but if they were challenged, and they weren't always challenged, it became a lot more personal. So, and we heard people saying things online, or read people saying things like, talking about kind of education. It's my boys, my ordinary white boys, are actually paying the price for anti-sexism. So, what does all this mean? Let's conclude. Well, I think what it clearly does demonstrate is that social media output isn't spontaneous. It is edited by every other form of social interaction. And in fact, there is an opportunity and a pressure to present your ideal self and to avoid negative personas online, trolls or oversharers or whatever it is. Social media is not truth per se. We hear some people in the industry, they talk as if anything on social media was the absolute truth, the absolute authentic voice of the consumer. This is not the case. It needs interpreting. There's conscious and unconscious material there, and it needs the same level of interpretation with other qualitative data. The constant availability of instant quantified feedback does seem to have an addictive element to it. And we would also say that people are becoming a little bit more introspective through their use of social media, a little bit more thin-skinned, to be frank. So that's what it means on a kind of a bigger canvas. What does it mean for researchers like us? Well, let's have a do's and don'ts list, because no presentation is finished without one of those. What I would say is, do accept, even embrace the fact that humans are complex people, and that people reveal layers of truth in different contexts and different environments. And therefore, we need to have an open mind about methodologies, maybe even always try and talk to people in different methodologies to capture some of those different personas and different layers of truth. Don't waste your time seeking a single authentic voice of the consumer. It doesn't really exist. Life's too complicated for that. People are too complicated for that. Don't rely on a single methodology if you can help it. And please don't rely on the belief that social media is ready, refined insight. It needs interpreting. But most of all, I think what we all felt coming out of this project, the people who worked on it, that of course different mediums allow for different points of view and different personas to come through, but not all mediums are created equal. we think there is a unique role of face-to-face qualitative interview to actually anchor the rest of the different layers of insight. It gives you a unique way to get in the home and the world of the respondent, to see their picture on the wall, to see their hobbies, to get a sense of who they are, to hear their tones of voice in a much subtler way. And that can be a real anchor for the interpret all the things you find, and a new lens, in fact, all the things you find in those other mediums, like, for example, online or through social media. So, thank you very much for listening. What I'm going to do now is pass you over to my colleague, Julie, who is going to talk to you about navigating a virtual world. Who's going to take you through the next paper. Thank you for listening.
Thank you, Peter. So the second half of our presentation is actually going to be based around a piece of self-funded research that we did, ultimately to answer the following broad contention. Are online conversations important and possibly better information sources for brands than the old regime of surveys? In other words, how much importance should we attach to social media sentiment, and does it accurately reflect the real world view? And of course, doing this piece of research also gave us the opportunity to pick up on some of the themes that Peter's just explored in his paper, and to see if we could actually expose or reveal some of these social media personas or identities in a more traditional survey setting, and try to put some numbers around some of the themes that we found. So what we're going to talk through, first of all, is a little bit about the actual piece of research that we did. We actually spoke to a nationally representative sample of 2,000 interviews. They were sourced from a UK online panel, but although our respondents are UK residents, in fact, their online profile and social media usage is very comparable to the panels in the States. So if anyone's interested, we could potentially replicate the study over here in the States, but we'd expect to find very similar findings. So first of all, we'll set the scene just to get a feel for who we are looking at in that sample, and we'll share a few key stats about our respondents' social media behaviours. Then we'll take a little time understanding more about who we're engaging with when we look at social media sentiment, and relatedly, what drives participation and engagement in the various platforms that are now available. And then finally, we'll take a look at the key question raised in Peter's paper about how authentic our social media selves are, and see if we can get people to admit to some of their ultimate selves in a quantitative survey. So, who are we looking at in our sample? Well, the first big stat is that 84% of the people we spoke to are social media users, and that's actually very comparable to the US panels over here. It's much higher than for an offline audience. So actually in the UK, the national average is around 53%, and the US census data tells us that about the same proportion of Facebook users over here. So pretty similar figures across the two countries, but much bigger social media usage on the online panel than in the average population. Almost all of the younger audience use social media, as you'd expect, and that actually reflects the national average pretty well. And we were also able to identify an elite group of what we're calling super users who access social media sites at least 10 times a day, and of course, some of them many more times than that. And we're going to take a bit of a deep dive look into those super users because they're pretty interesting in terms of how they are contributing to that noise and that buzz. So let's take a look at the social media landscape. We've got a pretty big sample, so it gives us an opportunity to take a look in detail. This slide shows us who's using what, basically. So in the first column, we can see who the most dominant players are. No surprise that we've got Facebook up there, 3/4 of the sample using Facebook. followed by YouTube, although that might be slightly inflated insofar as that 57% may or may not all be members of YouTube, because of course you can view the content without actually having an account. In the second column, we've got players who are used by around a third of our sample. Twitter, you can see, is a bit more niche. It seems a bit smaller than you might have thought, based on the amount of noise it generates in the media. Google Plus has obviously grown very quickly over a short period of time at 24%. WhatsApp is of course a relative newcomer. I guess you'd describe that more as a messaging platform with a social aspect to it rather than a social media platform as such. But it's making some inroads there, and in fact, the usage is double amongst the younger audience. Then when you get to the third column here, you're moving into quite a long list of more niche players, as you can see. Pinterest was interesting to us as Adobe's written a social intelligence report back end of last year that talked about the fact that Pinterest actually drives the highest referral revenue of all the social media platforms. So that pin it button, in fact, has overtaken the Facebook like button on product pages. And in the US, users are spending more per order, in fact, more than double that of Twitter or Facebook. And I suppose that's related to the curatorial aspect of the site, which makes people a lot more engaged with its content. The data on this next chart is driven off whether people are using their individual social media platforms more or less than they were 12 months ago. So we can see what's becoming more popular in the top half of the chart, and similarly what's losing favour and sort of dying out in the bottom half of the chart. And clearly you can see from the shape of that line, we've got a pretty dynamic environment. Facebook and the brands that it fairly recently purchased, so I think Instagram was in 2012 and WhatsApp in 2014, have got quite a lot of momentum. So that's obviously been a good strategy for them. Down at the other end, you can see that Flickr seems to be dying out. And we know, of course, that Bebo and MySpace are falling heavily out of favour. What was interesting to us is this whole issue of Facebook's demise. This next slide takes a little look at usage in more detail. And really, it seems as though a lot of the noise around Facebook having reached saturation or even having reversed into a decline seems unfounded. I think the study that triggered a lot of that came out of Princeton University, and they were claiming that Facebook would have lost 80% of its users by 2017, something that obviously Facebook addressed directly as being unfounded at the time. But certainly our data seems to support the fact that Facebook is not in that situation. I think another study claimed that teenagers were leaving in their droves, but that also doesn't seem to be borne out by the momentum that we see here. Our 18 to 24-year-olds are telling us that they've actually increased their usage of Facebook compared to a year ago, or 21% of them are. So they're certainly very, very active and more engaged in general and using lots of different platforms, we know. But certainly from this data, it looks as though Facebook is still pretty central to them. And it's certainly not necessarily being replaced, even if it's being added to. Twitter, of course, has a much more pronounced skew towards younger people in the first place. So you'd actually almost expect the younger audiences to be driving usage. So that net plus 24% change amongst the 18 to 24-year-olds is perhaps not surprising. But it looks as though the older audiences that have tried Twitter are less likely to go back. So they might set up an account and try it, but it doesn't look as though it's a platform of choice for them. They're lapsing more than they're increasing their usage. So who are the online opinion formers? In this next section, we're trying to understand who it is that's creating all the noise online. We segmented the sample according to people's level of social media activity and pulled out 3 key groups. The group in the middle there, the medium users, account for the majority of our sample. These people access social media sites 9 times a day to 2 times a week. Of course, you can split that down a lot more, but we just thought for simplicity's sake, we'd isolate 3 groups for today. As you can see, a third of them are young people. They have an average of 4 social media platforms, 195 friends, 216 followers. We also included a measure to assess how important social media was in the context of people's lives overall. It was a pretty tough measure. At the top end of the scale, we asked people whether or not it was essential to their life, whether they could live without it. And the number of people that agreed to that, just 6% there in the medium bucket. And then we also asked people how regularly they were either looking at feeds or posting their own news, and reasonable levels of activity there in that medium group. The light users on the right-hand side, they represent a quarter of our sample, and they're using social media less than 2 times a week. They tend to be older, perhaps no surprise there, and they seem to have much lower engagement, so far fewer friends. They're certainly not posting very often. They seem to be quite passive in the way that they're using social media. But the interesting group here is the super users, and these are the ones we referred to earlier. So they only represent a minority, only 15% of our sample, but they're accessing social media more than 10 times a day, and some many more than that. These guys are the ones that have the really big footprint, and their engagement seems much, much higher. So they're much younger. They're working across 7 platforms on average. They have much larger networks and are much more regularly posting. And these are the people that are saying they really can't live without their social media accounts, that they're kind of reliant on it in that way. So I suppose the point here is that if you're measuring noise, it's really the super users whose views you're more likely to be listening to. You're not as likely to be getting a broadly representative view across all social media users as a whole, because it's really the super users that are doing most of the talking. We also looked at brand engagement. So how are people interacting with brands? And we took a look across sort of 3 different measures of that. The first one was people's activity insofar as liking or following different brands. And just 12% told us that they regularly did that. 29% told us they did occasionally like or follow brands. So it's quite low, really. When we look at how that varies by the different subgroups in our sample, we do see that our super users are more likely to like and follow brands. And then there's also a couple of other demographic groups that are more active in that regard. The second measure was the degree to which people are posting positive comments about a brand as a result of having a good service experience. And again, fairly low levels of activity, but our super users are significantly more likely to be posting positive comments than other groups. And then the third measure, just the flip side of that, so people's likelihood to make negative comments about having a bad experience. Even fewer are actually making an effort to post those sorts of comments online, even though I suppose social media sites have really become a conduit for complaint now that people feel brands are listening, but still pretty low. But in terms of posts, our super users are again more vocal. So they really seem to be the ones that, you know, despite only representing a minority of our sample, they're the ones that are making up the vast majority of those people here that are actively engaged with brands, which really just reinforces the point that we made a minute ago, that if you're only measuring noise, you're more likely to be measuring the super users than the whole population of social media users. This next section picks up on some of the elements that Peter's paper that talk about how our personality influences what we do and how we behave on social media. We set about, first of all, trying to prove or disprove this myth that extroverts are heavier users of social media than introverts. And we did this by asking a 20-question quiz based on the ideas of Susan Cain, who is a leading thinker on this subject. We used Susan Cain's way of segmenting people into introverts, extroverts, and also ambiverts, the midway category. And then we looked at the way that usage behavior varied between those segments. Now, at least on the basis of usage behavior, we didn't actually find any differences between extroverts and introverts. In other words, we couldn't find any evidence really that personality has a massive effect on what people are doing on social media, which really supports Peter's earlier claim. However, we did find that introverts have a different relationship with social media than extroverts. And we found that by asking people to respond to a battery of attitudinal statements related to how they feel about social media and their activity on social media. And what we've shown on this slide are just the attributes where there was a significant difference between the introverts and the extroverts. So our introverts, our line in purple there, are much more likely to agree that Facebook, for example, is a great way to keep in touch. They're much more likely to be careful about their tweets and to be concerned about how they're phrasing things and what they're leaving out there in the social media landscape for other people to see. Relatedly, they're more worried about how their children are using social media. So they're a little bit more cautious in terms of what they're putting out into the public realm. They're also much more likely, though, to enjoy that validation aspect of social media. In other words, they're a bit more susceptible to that feel-good factor that comes from having people post back to you or repost what you've posted. And that seems to support the earlier discussion that we had around how introverts kind of feel closer to themselves online. The extroverts, which on the other hand are in our green line here, are much more gung-ho. They're less likely to stress about how they're coming across, so sort of more likely almost to pass a comment or make a tweet without giving it a second thought. And also, interestingly, though, they're less likely to bask in that positive reinforcement of having people respond to their tweets and their posts. So it's interesting. Maybe what social media does is it kind of creates this. It creates a way for them to avoid the trauma of meeting people directly, the stress surrounding that, but at the same time giving them a way to keep in touch and gain validation at arm's length, as it were. But regardless, the point here, I suppose, is although the super users are the ones that are more likely to be doing the talking, we've got extroverts and introverts equally likely to be contributing to that noise. So we did another similar quiz, this time based on a measure of self-esteem. And we classified people into high, normal, and low range self-esteem based on Rosenberg's scale. He's got one of the most widely used measures in social science. And as you might expect, of course, most of our sample falling into that normal range. But what's interesting is if you look at how self-esteem varies among people who say to us that they couldn't live without social media. So that sort of subgroup that really feels strongly reliant on social media. And when you look at how they fall out on this scale, you can see that actually a much higher percentage of them, so about a third of them, actually fall into that low self-esteem range compared to 18% overall. The other interesting difference is that when we look at super users, we see a similar pattern. So in fact, 30% of super users fall into the have low self-esteem versus that 18% on average. So very, very interesting how that manifests. I guess, of course, you could interpret that in a lot of ways. Probably poses more questions than it actually answers. So, you know, is social media a way of boosting self-esteem? Or could you actually infer that those people that have low self-esteem have a bit of an unhealthy relationship with the accounts, with the social networking accounts that they are members of? Within the context of our online survey, we also attempted to answer the question about how authentic online opinions are by trying to replicate Peter's case studies showing how people present themselves differently online versus offline. And I suppose in the end, this part proved to be a little bit too much to do quantitatively, but we had a crack at it. The way that we approached this was to try to apply some of the enabling techniques that exist in qualitative to help us expose the subconscious or the non-rational underlying motivations that people have, and use those in a quantitative setting. So we really focused on projectives as the main questioning technique. So we would ask people the same question in two different ways. First of all, the traditional direct ask and tell way, you know, tell us whether you personally exhibit this behavior. And then the projected version of that, tell us what you think whether you think other people exhibit this behavior. The first set of tests were a bit more successful than the second, in that we did get some people admitting that their personas on social media were different from their real world personas. Let me just talk you through those first of all. So this very first test was about the extent to which people are more expressive, exaggerate their opinions, boast about their lifestyles online, more so than they would do in real life. So when we asked people to tell us whether they felt that they did boast more online, whether they were more opinionated, you can see that very few people were willing to agree that applied to them. However, when we asked them to think about their friends and whether they exhibited those characteristics, they were much more likely to agree. So around 1 in 2 people agreed that yes, they saw their friends boasting online and that they thought their friends were more opinionated online than in real life. So the projectives there actually allow people to agree that online behavior is different. I suppose that goes to show just how unreliable we are as witnesses to our own behavior, and it also just shows how differently we perceive our own behavior versus other people. This second test is the one that didn't work quite so well, but we'll show it to you just out of interest. So in this particular question, going back to, we got people to rate themselves in terms of their views on some very big social issues. And the reason for focusing in on those very big social issues like politics and immigration is all based around that hypothesis that people are a more magnified version of themselves on social media. So we asked people to put themselves onto a scale on both these social topics, in terms of politics from very left-wing to very right-wing, and in terms of immigration, should immigration increase or should it be reduced? And we asked people to consider themselves, how they perceive themselves, first of all, and then whether other people would, how other people would see them if they were to watch their tweets on those subjects. So when it comes to politics, you can see that their own view of themselves hovers around the midway mark. But in fact, there's a strong belief that if anyone were to read those tweets, they would get a very accurate account of who they actually were in reality. So not a huge difference between the perceived self versus the perceptions of other people's view of them. And a very similar finding when we come to immigration. So people's own view of themselves hovers at a very similar point on that scale to the way they think other people see them based on their tweet. The third topic that we talked to them about was sexism. Now, what's interesting here is that you see a slightly bigger gap between people's own view of themselves and how they think they might be perceived by others. So just on this topic, and some men basically admitting that they're more sexist, they might be seen to be more sexist than they are if somebody read their tweets. So why are men more sexist on Twitter? Do people really have different personas? Are the social rules different on Twitter? Well, we'll leave you with some of those questions and just conclude on what this all really means for us. Well, as researchers, we know that we need to be mindful of a couple of key points then when looking at social media sentiment. It's a big issue. It's increasingly important, of course, that companies understand what people are saying about them over the internet. Companies' reputations can potentially live or die by what people say about them online. So understanding the buzz is a vital component of research. But we need to be aware that social media monitoring mainly takes into account the views of a noisy minority, and a significant % of people are actually not on social media, or they're only lightly engaged with social media. The second thing that we need to be mindful of is that people's personas on social media can be different from the real world persona, and that we do see some evidence of at least unconscious posturing. We know that people are potentially unreliable witnesses to their own views and opinions, and so we need to take that into account. From a marketing perspective, clearly Facebook is still the #1 social media platform. It shouldn't be discounted, and it's really still a very major channel for brand engagement. And from our data, at least, it looks as though that trajectory is on the upwards rather than on the downwards trend. Because social media is noisy, we need to make sure that we're not only looking at volume, but also looking at meaning. And then the third thing there is that it might be worth knowing more about that small vocal minority, our super users, to find out a bit more about what makes them tick. They're obviously an important group contributing heavily to that conversation, and we need to engage with them very carefully. That brings us to the end of our second presentation. Thank you very much for listening. We appreciate you being here for our inaugural webinar, and we look forward to the next opportunity. Thanks so much.